or that I do work with suttas. Who here knows what a sutta is? Okay, is anyone who doesn't know what a sutta is? That's all right.
Is it sutra? Is
Sutta,
that the word you're using?
sutra,
Oh, yes.
sutta in Pali, sutra in Sanskrit. Excellent, we've already learned something. Okay, so Pali, sutta, in Sanskrit, sutra. Okay, so everybody here knows what a sutta is? Can somebody tell me what a sutta is?
Discourse.
Discourse, so it's a translation of it. Can you tell me something more about it?
Well, sutras.
Like, yeah, what do we mean when we say something's a sutta? So if I say, for example, somebody might say, in the Satipatthana Sutta, it says X, Y, Z. So what does it mean when we say that? What is that?
Discourse where the Buddha was teaching something.
Okay, a discourse when the Buddha is teaching something, all right? Is that correct? Is that right?
Or is it the story of the Buddhas and his people and his disciple?
The story of the Buddha and his teachings and disciples?
Yeah.
Okay. It's more usually like a teaching. I mean, it includes stories about the Buddha, but more usually is a teaching from the Buddha or his disciples. But that's more or less correct. Now, if you know me at all, you probably know that this is a trick question. So we'll get to that in a minute. So we've got some idea, like a sutta is a teaching by the Buddha. Okay, fair enough. Now, but what really does it mean? I mean, say somebody says, okay, in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha said we should be mindful and we should meditate mindfully, right? Something like that, okay? Fair enough? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. No? You're not sure?
Well, sort of. I mean, sort of instructional. The Satipatthana Sutra is it sort of the Buddha teaching how to meditate, not just...
Yeah, that's true, yeah. And but just as a general thing, so the Satipatthana Sutra is about how the Buddha's teaching how to practice mindfulness. Is that fair enough? Yeah?
Yeah, but there's another piece of it, though, too, which is it needs also to plant a seed. It needs to ask a question that we take in.
Okay, yeah. That's a very good point. Yeah, it doesn't just exist as some kind of fixed entity, but it comes to life in some kind of relation, right? I mean, at the very least, you have to pick the book up and read it, right? As a starting point, yeah. Have to have some idea of what's in there. Okay. So you see all of these books around here, right? I mean, one of the purposes of a library like this is just to preserve things, right? So you can gather things, collect them, and preserve them, but they just stay on the shelves until someone picks up and reads it, and then it becomes something real. Okay, so the Satipatthana Sutta teaches that mindfulness. Would it shock you to know that the word mindfulness doesn't appear anywhere in the Satipatthana Sutta? Well, for a start, the Buddha didn't speak English. So, Satipatthana Sutta is about how to practice sati, which we is awareness? Is that what it means?
Well, that's something.
Well,
that's the translation I've heard.
Fair enough. So sati. So we translate it as mindfulness. So there's already some kind of distance there, right? We're reading it through a filter, right? Which paints a particular picture. Now, I spent 2.5 years staying by myself on an island off the coast of Taiwan, translating Pali, and so I spent all day, every day, just reading Pali and translating it, and listening to what the Buddha said, and trying to express that in the language that I knew. And so any translator is very well aware of how problematic that process is. And by the time I finished it, it occurred to me that being a translator was like killing Schrodinger's cat over and over again. Every word, you know Schrodinger's cat and the thought experiment with Schrodinger's cat, like in quantum theory? No? Yes? No? Okay, so in quantum theory, particles exist in a state of ambiguity until they're observed. So they can be either a wave or a particle, depending on how you look at it and how you think about it. And it's only when you actually observe it that it becomes one or the other. So the thought experiment, and please be aware, this is purely a thought experiment. No cats are actually harmed in this experiment. In this thought experiment, there's a cat inside a box, and there's a Geiger counter and a piece of radioactive material. And the radioactive material is the particles are decaying, according to quantum theory, randomly. There's no known causal agent, and when the Geiger counter goes, it doesn't just make a beep, but it releases a deadly gas, which is going to kill the cat. But the point about this is we don't know, the cat is actually in an ambiguous state until somebody opens the box and looks in. Is it alive? Is it dead? So to me, this is like every word is like that living cat, and it has many potentials and many possibilities, and it has a whole life which can mean so many different multiplying meanings. And I have to open up the box, kill the cat, and say it means this thing. And so this to me is the process of translation. It's a tragic and traumatic event. Every sentence you leave behind a line of dead cats. Anyway, that's how I felt after doing it. It's not the only way I felt about it, but it's a feeling that occurred to me from time to time. Okay, so we have a translation. Okay, so translating from the Pali. So we have a Pali sutta called the Satipatthana Sutta. Is that correct? Is that correct? Now you notice I slipped in an indefinite article into that question. We have a Pali sutta. Actually, there are two Pali suttas called Satipatthana Sutta. There's the Majjhima Nikaya version, Majjhima 10, and there's the Digha Nikaya, Digha Nikaya 22. So which one is the Satipatthana Sutta? And then there's a Chinese translation by the Sarvastivadins, and another Chinese translation by the Mahasangikas. And then there is whole big chunks of the Satipatthana Sutta which are found in the Prajnaparamita Sutta, which I'm sure we've got in Tibetan up here somewhere, yes? And it's basically exactly the same, but where the Pali says like a bhikkhu walks out mindfully and walks back mindfully, in the Tibetan version it says a bodhisattva walks out mindfully and walks back mindfully. Right? Apart from that, it's like letter by letter the same. So what exactly is the Satipatthana Sutta again? It starts to get a little bit complicated, doesn't it? We thought that something was very simple, and the more we look at it, then the more complicated it becomes. So, just to come back to that, the Pali, the suttas, that when we're talking about suttas or discourses are, yes, the teachings of the Buddha, and they are the teachings of the Buddha in certain times and places. So we're not talking about a collected or an abstracted bunch of teachings where it like summarizes, this is what the Buddha's teaching is. Right? So this is what the traditions later did. They later come along and said, we've got all these suttas, it's kind of unwieldy, let's write a book that explains this is what Buddhism is. Right? And we still do that, right? Buddhist bookstores are full of that kind of book. But in the suttas, what we find is like the Buddha's encounters with people, real life people, and asking questions, and having conversations, and getting challenged, and meeting all of these strange kind of characters who were wandering around India 2,500 years ago. And so it's a very embedded set of teachings. Right? It's very much local and responding to that environment. So this is one of the things that's really, to me, is very fascinating and very inspiring about the suttas, is that it's so, it's such a living teaching, and so alive. The Buddha's, it's unexpected. The Buddha, who's going to show up, right? And someone's going to come, and the Buddha's going to respond to that person who's in front of him that day. Or the other disciples, not just the Buddha speaking, but most of the suttas have the Buddha speaking. Many of those people to whom the Buddha was speaking were not Buddhists. And this is one of the distinguishing features of the early Buddhist literature as compared to later Buddhist literature. Later Buddhist literature is almost always Buddhists talking to other Buddhists. Early Buddhist literature, yes, Buddhists talking to other Buddhists, the Buddha talked to his, the monks or different disciples. But often, and I haven't done the numbers, but maybe the majority of suttas in the Digha Nikaya A lot of the suttas are the Buddha in conversation with people of different paths. Jains, Brahmins, wanderers, skeptics, nihilists, materialists. And they engage in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes very antagonistic, sometimes very kind of deceitful and manipulative, sometimes in a way that's very productive, very much meeting of minds. So there's not like a kind of a formula for how the Buddha does this, but again, it's like living experience. So this is, again, is one of, for me, the reasons why these early suttas are particularly valuable, because they record, because it's much like the world that we live in. We live in a realm, we're not living in a Buddhist culture or a Buddhist country, we're living in a world where we're surrounded by people of all different backgrounds and all different approaches and beliefs and things like that. And so we can learn so much from how the Buddha dealt with that situation. Now, when I began as a young monk and started learning and practicing Dhamma, as I was talking about this just the other day, and Nam was there, and my first encounter was to do a very intensive Vipassana retreat in Chiang Mai. And then at the end of that retreat, I wanted to learn something about Buddhism. Before I did that retreat, I literally knew nothing about Buddhism. I never read any books, don't know anything. And I just did the retreat because it was cheap. Only on donations, right? So I could go there and I didn't have any money, so that's excellent. So I thought, oh, I can go and stay for a while for free, and maybe I'll learn something while I'm there. That would be fun. So that's what I did. And I don't know if you remember one, but one of the times we were at Bodh Gaya, Ajahn Tong was there. Mm-hmm. You know Ajahn Tong?
That's where we did our retreat. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Ajahn Tong.
So this was my first retreat with Ajahn Tong as well, and Nampet as well.
Susi as well.
Oh, okay. So lots, you see the influence that people have. And now Ajahn Tong, so forward-thinking to introduce meditation for foreigners, right? And of course later he also became one of the great supporters of bhikkhunis in that area, and he's one of the, he's the most, I think, senior and influential monk in northern Thailand now, would that be correct? Yeah? And he's supporting Nirodha Ram.
We were just looking at a video yesterday
Yeah.
of him giving the keynote teaching to a large group of women who have just gone forth. 100 of them, I think.
Wow.
He came to give the Dhamma days and there's the video of it. And it's really, really awesome, because I think he's mindful of death and impermanence, and so the quality of his teaching. And for those who haven't had the opportunity to go forth and having, I think it's a 10-day ordination program,
Okay.
and really trying to help them get what best they can in this life within these 10 days.
Right.
So just a sense of strong mindfulness of impermanence and the door of opportunity being open. That was awesome teaching.
And that was just recently, so he's still...
I was watching this yesterday, yes.
Oh, my goodness.
It's contemporary right now.
Still teaching, that's incredible.
Some of our friends who are here have joined the temporary ordination program, who are with us for the Vasa.
Okay. So, yeah, amazing that kind of mind who has that way of thinking is one of... He joins that. I'm reminded that in Sri Lanka you had a similar phenomenon where some of the monks who had... In Sri Lanka, they ordain according to caste, which is kind of terrible. But some of the monks who had spoken out against that and tried to change that were also the monks who supported bhikkhuni ordination. And so that kind of comes from wisdom, comes from understanding Dhamma.
And faithfulness to the Buddha.
Right? Yeah. Okay, so meditation, and then I wanted to read something. During the retreat we weren't allowed to read, so afterwards they gave me a book, what can I read? And they gave me a couple of Dhamma books. And I thought, nah, it's alright. It wasn't that exciting. It was like, alright, yeah, that's fine. I didn't find it that that exciting. If you want to know what books they were, I'll tell you in private afterwards. But then they showed me the suttas, and they said, "Where's the real stuff?" And so he showed me the Majjhima Nikaya. I thought, that's the real stuff. So I started reading the Majjhima Nikaya, Yanamoli's translation, and that was the end of that. So these have been the two real spurs for me and inspirations for me in my spiritual development since then, is meditation and the study of the suttas and understanding the suttas. And I've had the opportunity, a great opportunity, to be able to pursue those two things in my life, and very privileged as a bloke, and as a bloke, can I say bloke? Is that an American word? No?
No, but it's a nice one.
We know it.
It's not, you know what it means. No, sorry, bloke.
Bloke.
You know what bloke means?
It's a blog.
No, I'm not.
That's the accent.
I have a blog, but
You
I
had that
am
blog,
a
yeah, I know.
bloke. Okay.
That's why I thought you said blog. My brain filled it in.
Okay.
Bloke. Got it.
Got it, yeah. So, and as a white bloke, then I had opportunities, and I could travel to Thailand and be accepted and go to the monastery and looked after, and everyone was very respectful and very nice. So that's good. That's how the world should be, right? And so I've always felt that because of the opportunities that I've had, and that I was so very kindly offered through the Buddhist tradition, that it was part of my responsibility to give that back and to try to give others the opportunity to practice as well. Now, in the tradition that I trained in the Thai forest tradition, has many strengths, but study of the suttas is not really one of them. And you didn't really get a lot of support for studying the suttas. And so I pretty much taught myself. I mean, like probably many of you probably read Bhikkhu Bodhi's books and these kinds of things, so I would do that. I taught myself Pali. And one of the things that I sort of found out along the way was that the suttas that I'd known in Pali were not the only suttas there were. In Thailand, it's a Theravada country, and so people teach the Pali Canon and so on. And then I realised, actually there's whole bunches of suttas in Chinese, there's whole bunches of suttas in Tibetan, there's whole bunches of things in Sanskrit, and so I started to study and explore about what these things were and what the connections were. And of course, these different canonical collections have, all of them have their own long, complicated history. They each tell in their own way a story not just about the Dhamma, but also a story about the people who have conveyed that Dhamma from that time to this time. And they have like a local expression, and they also have something which is shared in common. And so, of course, we know that all of the core teachings of the Dhamma are shared across all of the Buddhist traditions. And this is something which is, so obvious when we're reading any of the suttas, or if we're listening to any of the great teachers. And then you can see that all of the great teachers who you listen to, no matter what tradition they come from, always have a way of bringing things back to what are those things that really matter, which come from being mindful, and also various other languages as well. And one of there's many things about that, but one of the things that strikes me about long years of studying the suttas is that the suttas exist as, or can exist as a challenge and as a point of questioning for how we do things. And often suttas are seen not in that way at all. Often suttas are seen as being something which is there to enforce an orthodoxy. Right? So we have like an authority, we have an institution, we have a tradition or a lineage, and the suttas are there to enforce that lineage. But they do more than that. Right? So in that way, by enforcing that lineage, then they create a sense of connection, through creating a sense of connection with the past. And that's one of the functions that ancient scripture does, obviously. But they also are there as a voice of conscience for us. and as a voice of conscience, because who we are and who our traditions are is always changing. And we tend to imagine that our tradition is whatever we've seen, or whatever we might have grown up with, or whatever we might have, read about in a book or something like that. We have this idea of tradition, and yet the reality is, of course, that tradition is always changing. And tradition is not a dead thing. Tradition is not something which we kind of inherit some blueprint from the past and just impose it on the present and impose it on the future. Tradition is a conversation. It's an evolution, and it's something that we can join into. And this is something that I first began to really notice when we started to look into the question of Bhikkhuni ordination, because for the first time I realized that actually my tradition was doing something that wasn't right, and I didn't agree with it. And that's really hard. It's really hard to be in that situation where your faith and your feeling of connection and belonging is then starting to be severed. And I looking back on it now, I realize that, I think we all have our particular perspectives on this. But I think one of the reasons for me that it was hard was because, again, I had that privilege of being a white man, and I hadn't had to really sort of struggle with that question of what's my relationship with things. I belonged because, well, things in the world, I don't know if you've noticed, but they're usually set up for white men. So that usually so I hadn't really had to challenge those things inside myself. And so this was like the first time where I was in that situation. I thought, no, this is not who I am. And so we started doing this kind of research. We started listening to what the women were saying. We started looking at the examples of the Bhikkhuni ordination, which had been done from the 1970s in the Tibetan tradition, with Venerable Pamo, Venerable Somo, and others. The ordinations in the late 1989?
1988.
No, sorry, 1988 in
California.
That was in California. That was in where?
Southern California.
In LA, in that other country.
Hacienda Heights. Yes.
Yes. Okay, in that other country, Southern California. Yes. And so these women from different parts of the world, including Sri Lanka and India, were starting to take Bhikkhuni ordination. And so we started to research into it and to look into this, and I started to get this kind of resistance from the people in my tradition, like my seniors, my ajahns, my teachers. Not all of them, but some of them. And I didn't know how to deal with it. It was weird. And so that whole process was a very, very personal journey for me, and was a real process of finding a sense of discovery. When I look back at it now, and then I can think, well, it's growing up. You have to learn how to make up your own mind about things. And I think all too often in spiritual life that we displace maybe, our authority figures or our father figures or whatever it is on the Sangha or on the teacher or on the guru, and somehow there has to be a process of being able to make up our own mind about things. So it was a very painful process for me, but one which I really treasure, because it meant that even though certain kinds of relationships were broken or damaged, but then others which have been much more meaningful for me have developed and been maintained throughout the years. And I am, whenever I go back to a monk's monastery, where there's only monks living with other monks, then I am so incredibly grateful that I don't just live in a monk's monastery anymore. And it's much better to have friendships with the nuns and friendships, because it gets very blokey very quickly. And it's a boys' club, and it's a kind of a nice boys' club, right? It's not like a bad boys' club. If you can have a boys' club, monastery is a pretty good one. usually, but still, there's just something about the feeling of that I learnt through living with nuns, which really changes the way you are in community. Anyway, so coming back to this idea of the sutta, and so all of this time studying, looking at the suttas and trying to get to a better sense of like what a sutta is. And the more you go into it, the more you realise that what the suttas are and what they're saying is something which is quite flexible, which is quite interpretive, and which is quite unknown. And particularly unknown, and I think curiously so, in the Buddhist tradition. Like, I don't know if you noticed, and it's quite different, I think, in Tibetan tradition. I don't want to speak too much about Tibetan Buddhism or other traditions, but certainly in Theravada Buddhism, the study of the suttas is quite rare. I mean, we talk a big game about the suttas, but we don't actually study them very much. Still less the practice of it, okay? Now, this is not sort of evenly true across all Theravadan countries. In Sri Lanka, there's more emphasis on studying suttas.
Becoming more common, I think.
Perhaps becoming more common. Some more movements in Thailand with the Buddha Vachana movement.
During the last 10 years, especially.
Right, yeah. And that's been the most sort of, I understand, the most kind of vibrant new movement in Buddhism.
I think so.
Yeah.
In Theravada Buddhism.
Yeah.
Internationally.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that Meng wants to talk about tomorrow, actually.
It's
How do you
interesting that
harness
it's
this?
arisen together with the revival of Bhikkhuni ordination.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a reason.
Yes,
I think. I was
exactly.
contemplating what is the reason.
Yeah.
What do you see for that?
Because it's because what the Buddha taught is good, and it's getting you back, and it's getting back to that expression from what the Buddha taught.
I have another reason.
Okay.
Because 50 to 100 years ago in Theravada Buddhism, the idea was that the noble attainments were no longer possible.
Right.
And so the aim of Theravada Buddhism was to make good merit and be reborn with
sorry,
Maitreya.
can I just put a pin in that 1 second? And I just want to make sure that idea is actually communicated to people here.
Yes.
Because many people here may not be familiar with that or used to that. Did everyone hear what I was just saying?
No.
Did you get that?
No.
No, not really.
Shall I say it again? 50 to 100 years ago, what was predominant or prevalent in Theravada Buddhism was the practice of making merit for fortunate rebirth with the next Buddha, Maitreya. And the idea was that the possibility for noble...
Could you speak up a bit? We can't hear you over here.
I'm trying my best. I actually have bronchitis, so you don't want me to talk too loud or I'll start coughing. But so the idea was that the noble attainments in the path, the Arahanta path that the Buddha taught in early Buddhism, were no longer possible. But what's happened, particularly in Burma with Vipassana movements and also the forest traditions, is great masters who are considered to be either Arahantas or on the Arahanta path with noble attainments have emerged and taught widely, even increasingly widely, and people have heard and have practiced and also realized noble attainments, and those with noble attainments have got around the world. And so the idea that there's no point in doing anything other than putting the suttas up in a golden or crystal beautiful case, and there's no point in reviving Bhikkhuni ordination, because for what? Let that be for the time of the future Buddha Maitreya, when the teaching can be practiced effectively again for the ending of suffering. But with the understanding that the path still works, the practice still works, and the emergence of those with noble attainments in Theravada Buddhism, then that's undermined the whole basis for thinking there's no point in really doing it in this lifetime or in this generation. And then the motivation that's there when the Buddha was teaching live, that is, effects can come from this and are coming from this, and they can be seen here and now for oneself, as it says in the suttas, then the faith in that being possible has re-arisen in our world. And more people, because they're practicing, and they think it might be possible, and they see examples of those with attainment, then the key ingredients that are there to generate awakening in the path are present. And people are making progress and gaining benefits. And so the idea there's no point in Bhikkhuni ordination, or there's no point in teaching people directly from the suttas because they're not going to get it, it's no longer relevant, it's a Dharma ending age, all of that, those have all been challenged in this time just because people are getting it. And thus the relevance is awake and alive in our contemporary times. And this is underpinning what Bhante is doing, I imagine. Why would he want to make the teaching so widely accessible and available in people's own languages for them to have access to it? Is it just for the generation of faith? Or is there more to it than that? I would posit that there is more to it than that, and that's part of your motivation.
I suspect you may be onto something there, Ayya. Yeah, and so this is a very something I think most people perhaps outside of the traditional countries don't really realize this, to what extent that this idea had taken over. In the early 20th century in Thailand, they actually removed the references to Nibbana from the ordination procedure for the monks.
Removed by royal decree.
Yeah, so before you was like, I want to become a monk so I can realize Nibbana, then they took that bit out. Yeah. So anyway, these are shifts. Like I said, tradition is not something which is fixed. Tradition is something which is always changing.
It was due to a then contemporary traditional attitude,
Right.
which has now shifted,
Right.
so that for the purpose of the realization of Nibbana in truth for oneself has come back into the ordination script, not only for bhikkhus.
Not only for bhikkhus, yes.
So why has it shifted, or how has it shifted? I mean, it's a rhetorical question, but why is it shifting?
Okay. So the good question, complicated question, but I think one of the main reasons was because of one of the sort of the root causes was the encounter between Buddhism and the West. And in the especially colonial eras, basically Englishmen go to these countries and say your religion's rubbish, it's just a bunch of superstition, you're just doing black magic, you're just worshipping all of these gods, and we're rational and scientific, so believe us. Yeah? And there's probably, and I'm kind of exaggerating, but probably kind of not also. And the thing is that that's not entirely wrong, because if you go to traditional Buddhist countries, then there is a lot of that stuff. There is a lot of superstition, and there's a lot of black magic, and there's a lot of these kinds of things, and that's still the case today. But of course, that's not all there is to it. And there's also these very deep wisdom traditions, and these very deep contemplative traditions, and deep philosophical traditions. And so the people in various countries started to rediscover those and started to promote those. This is what we call modernist Buddhism. Modernist Buddhism begins probably mid-19th century as a response of Buddhist communities to the challenges of colonialism. And modernist Buddhism manifested in different ways in different countries. Some forms, and the one thing to remember is that almost every form of Buddhism that you are likely to encounter is modernist Buddhism in one way or another, unless you maybe go to some mountaintop in Bhutan or something like that, but pretty much. Or that cave you went to in Myanmar or something like that, you might encounter something. But so it manifests in different ways. For example, engaged Buddhism, right, is one form of modernist Buddhism. So people would criticize Buddhists because you just do funeral ceremonies, you just do rituals. And so some of the monks in Taiwan said, well, look, we'll do a kind of Buddhism that engages with people in a human way. It's called humanistic Buddhism or engaged Buddhism. And in different countries this happened in different ways. In Myanmar especially, and also in Thailand, there was a big resurgence of meditation. And in fact, that was how what we know today as meditation was invented. The idea of the meditation retreat, the idea of a meditation method and schools of meditation, and these kinds of things were developed in that time. So it was basically a way of repackaging traditional practices in a way that would make sense for our modern world. And so that inspiration was not just that inspiration worked itself out in complex ways. For example, in Thailand, the mid-19th century, King Mongkut was very interested in Buddhist texts, and is very rational, very intelligent, very scientific, very engaging with philosophers and so on, but he wasn't really into meditation. So he reformed the Sangha but didn't really introduce meditation reforms. Then another generation of monks, Ajahn Mun and his forest monks, then took some of those same ideas and applied them in contemplative and meditative practice, which is where we get the forest tradition from. And so the ways that these things played themselves out in the different Buddhist countries was quite complex and particular, like it was different in the different countries. But one of the main things was that return to an emphasis on the experience, that these teachings that we find in these books are not just something to worship, they're not even just, which would have been a traditional approach, we put them on a shrine and worship them, not even just the sort of the modernist rationalist approach that there's a philosophy to study, but it's also something to experience. And it's from there that then later on that we have the mindfulness and other meditation practices that we're familiar with today. I'm sorry, someone was going to ask a question earlier.
Well,
say something?
Yeah. My reflection is that there's something that I call the opening of the door of wisdom, which comes later in life. I mean, this is the work that I do with people. And that arises out of the needs of the time in some way. We have two idea sets that come into conflict.
Yeah.
And then our job is to accept and understand them. And for instance, the process you were talking about of coming in contact with the sutras the way you do, it's changed you, and it changes the way you teach us. But it's a creative process, is how I see it.
Absolutely, yeah, very much so. I think that's a really critical point there. That engagement with the sutras, engagement with our tradition, is a creative process, and it always has been.
Generative process.
Yes, I mean, look at all the creativity you see around us, right?
It's always been that way.
Somebody thought, I'll do a tanka. Somebody made the first one, right? And it's a creative process that evolves, changes out. Okay, so in this process, so this is how I've always seen the suttas and how I've learned to engage with suttas and with the Buddhist tradition. Is it's something which is creative and something which is inspiring and something which is challenging. Because if we look at the suttas, it's challenging. The Buddha said you should let go of things, right? And one of the conversations we've been having recently is about how do we translate nibbana, right? Now, people find this very disturbing because actually the meaning of nibbana is extinguishment. And they're like, you can't translate it as extinguishment. I'm like, but that's what the word means. No, but people will be upset. I'm saying, good, they should be upset, right? But nibbana is scary. Yes, it's scary. Extinguishment is scary. And there's even suttas that talk about that. When the gods hear about the Buddha's teaching on nibbana, they start to get terrified. Well, we thought we were eternal, but actually we're impermanent. We thought this was going to last forever, but this is going to pass. So to me, when I see these things in the teachings that are challenging, that's not something to shy away from. That's something to say, there's probably something real in there. If the teachings are just telling me that I'm okay and that I can keep doing what I'm doing, I don't know, that's all right. But when it's saying something that's different from what I believe, different from what my values are, then that's an opportunity for me to learn. So, in doing this, through the areas that we're familiar with, the areas, we can discuss meditation and the philosophies of emptiness and dependent origination and these kinds of things. But it's interesting how those very exalted and very high dhammas actually manifest when we start to apply them to simple and everyday things. And this is another thing that we find in the early Buddhist scriptures, or Buddhist scriptures generally, is we find a large collection of what we call the Vinaya texts, or monastic, which talk about monastic discipline and monastic conduct. But these texts are particularly interesting because they show how the Buddha built an intentional community. Right? How he worked with not just okay, we can discuss the philosophy of emptiness and how these kinds of things, which is somewhat it's somewhat kind of elevated, like it's above ordinary life. But then it's like, who left the water in the water dipper in the toilet? Right? And should you empty the water dipper out when you leave the toilet, or should you leave the water in it? And then these are the kinds of things that the Buddha got drawn into, not necessarily because he wanted to, but because people would be arguing about it. And these practical things, like how do you organize a community, right? How do you resolve conflict? What do you do when you have there's some cases that come up in the Vinaya. There's one case where there were some monks who were badly behaved at Kosambi, and then they come to visit the monastery. And what do you do with these badly behaved monks? Right? Do we invite them in? Do we give them a place to stay? What do we do? How do we deal with ordination and with students, like mentorship of new people and bringing them in? All of these very practical things, which are all found in the Vinaya. And to me, these things are also very challenging because they give us a way that the Buddha was expressing his Dhamma in a very practical sense, in things that are very immediate. Now, I said before that tradition is not something which is fixed, but which evolves as people who want to practice Dhamma respond to the challenges of their time and their place, respond to the challenges of their life. And every generation has a somewhat different answer to that, because every generation faces different challenges. And in our, I've talked about some of the challenges that I've been through as a monk, but now, of course, we all share that huge challenge that we're facing now with the climate crisis. And the climate crisis is something which is such a huge thing, so unfathomable, that I don't think it's possible for anybody to really sort of get their head around it. This is one of the big problems. You can't convey the scale of it. I did a talk at Sakyadhita on this topic a few months ago, and in the talk I gave a long list of different environmental crises that were happening in New South Wales, the place we were giving that talk. Possums falling dead out of trees because of the heat. The local power production still being only 13% renewables, and on it goes, and a big whole list. And then I said to the audience, well, this is really easy research, because all of these crises happened within about 3 or 4 days. Actually, while I was writing the article, these things appeared in the paper, and that was in one corner of New South Wales. And the same thing is happening everywhere around the world. And everywhere I go around the world, I talk to people about climate change issues, and they always have their own stories about it. And I was in Colombo. If you drive around Colombo now, Colombo, like most of the cities in South and Southeast Asia, is built essentially on a swamp. And you look around, the Parliament House is actually built like literally in a swamp. It's a nice building, but it's like also deeply metaphorical, and half the time you drive and you can't get anywhere because it's flooded, and you look at these rivers pouring down, brown, and that's all the soil, that's the land which is being washed away. When I was in Singapore, I sat down for a mealtime with some people, and one of them there happened to be a senior civil engineer, and I asked him about how the Singaporean government was responding. He said, well, actually this flat and most of the other flats in this area were flooded last night. They had very heavy rains, and the water was getting in. He said, actually these flats were all designed for 100-year floods. Now they flood every 4 or 5 years. Yeah. And I said, what if the government doing about it? What are you talking about doing? He's saying, well, they have a plan. They're thinking about raising a 1 metre wall all the way around Singapore. But the sea's going to rise more than 1 metre. Yeah, that's true, he said. They're planning on building a floating airport was another possibility. So all these kind of engineering responses. I say, okay, you're an engineer, so you're talking about engineering responses, but I mean, do you talk, like, how integrated is that? I mean, how do you have a floating airport if nobody can fly anymore because the economy's collapsed, right? And so everywhere you go, there are these different issues, manifests in different ways. And one of the occasions that was most powerful for me was earlier in the year when we did a retreat in Central Australia, and we took a group of people out there, and we stayed on an Aboriginal community called Lilla. It's a very small community, and the people there work with a local travel company to invite groups. They sometimes have school groups and so on, and you can go there and stay. Very simple. So you just have a swag, just like a bit of canvas and so on, you put on the ground and just sleep there under the stars. And we stayed there, we read the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, the sutta about the 4 elements, and we used it as a time for contemplating the elements, because they exist in a place like that. The elements exist in this incredibly pure and powerful form. And it's really astonishing. I mean, you can't really convey it, but when I was doing the Dhamma talks, I'd pick up a handful of earth, and it's just the earth there is this red, pure, beautiful, rich, and it's not dirt. We only made it dirt because we made it cities. Actually, the earth is really beautiful. And the people there, one of the guys in the community took us around and he showed us all to the different parts, and he told us the stories of their people and how they lived in that landscape. And one of the things that really struck me, because when we were reading the suttas, in the suttas we're talking about something which is another time and another place, right? And so we get this inspiration from that, and we can make that real because we can experience it inside ourselves. And if we read something like the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, it tells us about the 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air, and we can experience those elements inside ourselves. That's the thing that makes the suttas come alive. For the Aboriginal people, it's not just something that they would meditate on, but it's their whole world. It's everything around them. The story is the rocks and the water and the streams, and it's the history, and it's the changes, and it's the stars, like all the stories are in the stars as well. Everything around them, the direction that they go in, the food that they can eat, the story of the ancestors, these are all bound up in the stories that they tell. One elder that I talked to a couple of years ago, he began talking about the Aboriginal philosophy, and he said the most basic principle behind all of our philosophy is change. Fundamental principle of Aboriginal philosophy is impermanence. I said, really? Because this is what they watch. They look for what are the changes in the world that they live in. And those changes are how that they learn. And they have been in Australia for 50,000 years, and they've seen a lot of change. And those stories are still reflected there. One of the stories that they tell has a river in it. And so you have this mythological legend about a river. You know? Now, these legends are not just like story time, right? That's how you survive. Because you're walking across the desert, and the river's there or it isn't. And you either drink and live, or you don't drink and you die. So they're not messing around with these things. And so this particular story, there's a river, but on the land, there's no river. Now, I mean, this isn't that unusual in Australia. Most of our rivers and things are what they call dry rivers. They don't actually have water in them. But every few years it'll rain and they'll get water in. But here there was nothing. Until the geologists went and dug, and underneath they found that tens of thousands of years ago there was a river in that place. And those stories have been passed down all that time. No? This is telling us something about how this knowledge is being transmitted and about how we can keep this information alive. Our information, our Dhamma, has been kept alive for 2,500 years. And it still gives us the knowledge that we need to live, to meditate, to be alive, to realize, to have compassion. But those stories can't remain fixed, and the way that we respond to Dhamma can't remain fixed. One morning we were sitting with the fellow who was leading the group there. We're looking out over the land in Central Australia. Now, this is Central Australia. Has anyone been there? Been to Alice Springs or Ezra? You've been? Where did you go?
To the rock.
You went to the rock, Uluru.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were just around the corner in Kings Canyon, so not far away. Yeah. Look, there's like nothing for thousands of miles, okay? And it's just, when you drive across those country, you can drive and the road's just straight and there's just desert and you can like fall asleep and then like wake up and it doesn't really matter because there's nothing to hit anyway. And it's so remote. And we're looking out over this land and the Aboriginal friend who was there said, he's in his late 30s maybe. He said, it's changed so much since I was a kid. Yeah?
Wow.
All the grasses are different. Yeah, we're just looking at it's just desert with grass. All the grasses are different. These are all African grasses. These were brought in by the cattle farmers. So what happens in Australia, the grasses grow in clumps, and then when the fires come, they burn cool, and they regenerate the seeds. But that's not so good if you want to have lots of cattle on your property. So the cattle farmers put these African grasses in, but grow close together. And they just go wild across everywhere. And when they burn hot, because they're growing close together, and they destroy all the seeds. And they said a recent study had shown 100% of the seeds, the native seeds, had been killed by a fire with these grasses. And they're all across central and northern Australia. These grasses, he said, you used to be able to see all the wildflowers there. They're all gone now. Same thing, yeah? Because before it was an ecosystem, and now this isn't a cattle farm, this is an Aboriginal community, but the grass is infected. He said you used to be able to hear the dingoes at night, and now we can't hear the dingoes anymore. It's his land, he's seen those changes. We go out there and we think nothing could be more remote and pristine and pure than this. And for him, he's watching those changes. So this is the world that we live in, and we can't escape this. Change is happening right now. And the climate change and climate crisis is not something which is abstract and not something which is a sort of a political hobby horse to just bandy around. It's people's lives. The people in Puerto Rico, the 1 million people who are displaced in Mozambique from floods, the people in India who are dealing with the terrible pollution and the heat, people in Qatar dealing with 50 plus degree temperatures in the city. In Sydney, I was there in 2013, we had a day in the city of Sydney when it was 47 degrees. Can you imagine? 47 degrees. Were you there at the time, Jesse? 2013.
No.
They call it the angry summer. Yeah, you may have missed that one, yeah.
I think we also all don't know what 47 is.
47 degrees, everyone walks around in a daze and says, wow, it's really hot. And that's all you can do. Yeah. And at that kind of temperature, the animals start dropping dead out of trees, like the bats and so on. The train lines start to buckle, the roads start to melt, electricity grids start to collapse. Everything starts to unravel. And because of all these things, people start to move. Floods, storms, fires, disease, and people start to move. And it's the movement of people which is going to be our biggest and most immediate challenge from climate change. In our region, in the Southeast Asia, there will be probably 100 million displaced people within the coming decades, 25% of Bangladesh, Jakarta, they're already planning to move Jakarta. Bangkok is going to be underwater. Colombo is going to be underwater. Singapore is going to be underwater. And nobody has a clue how to deal with any of these things.
So that's the question then. How does Dhamma help you to deal with it?
Well, that's why we did the meditation on death, because there's going to be a heck ton of that.
You know, in the beginning you asked what is the sutta?
Yes.
And I was thinking about that and come back to that now. I think really the sutta is just the wisdom of the Dhamma with a heart of compassion to alleviate ignorance and suffering, meeting whatever circumstances are arising. And what we call a sutta is just a snapshot of that having happened.
Right.
But when it comes alive
Right.
for us, as this friend was saying, then this is the opening of the door of wisdom, meeting whatever is arising. So I see whatever is arising in this generation, in this time now, in our life circumstances, internal and external, our cultural, our societies, and the sutta is really just the wisdom of the Dhamma with compassion to alleviate and reduce and ignorance and suffering progressively, meeting the arising circumstances.
And those arising circumstances are changing.
Yes.
And they're different for everyone in every generation.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things, like I don't have any answers, and I am suspicious of anybody who says they have answers, because I think that we're facing an unprecedented time, and the challenges are going to be something completely unlike anything we've ever faced before. However, having said I don't have any answers, I do have a couple of thoughts of what may be useful from a Buddhist point of view in facing the challenges in the future. One of the things that that had occurred to me earlier in the year is that our life these days, it feels like we're kind of living in a horror movie, and so many bad things are happening that you feel like you can't do anything, and you have the feeling that the essence of the horror movie is that the monster is inside the house. And this is the basic metaphor of the horror movie. The monster is not something you go out into the jungle and face on a battlefield, like an action movie, but a horror movie, the monster is inside the house. And today, everything is inside the house. We don't have any wilderness anymore. I mean, you've got relative wilderness, like the Ranyabodhi or something, but still, we know it. It's all known, it's all mapped. The whole world is our house. And our task is not to win something or get something, but our task is to live. And one of the things that we can learn from horror movies is the moment of peak stupid in a horror movie. The words, "Let's split up." And as soon as you hear people saying, "Let's split up," you know bad things are going to happen. So this is something which I think is something that we should all take. I think very much is very absolutely key if we are going to survive and going to flourish and going to adapt to these new and these very challenging and probably devastating times. Don't split up. Stick together and figure out how to work together. Now, one of the key Buddhist virtues is the virtue of renunciation, the virtue of doing with less, doing with little. Right? Now, monastics are kind of experts when it comes to renunciation. It's kind of our thing. Yeah? And I think that it's really worth paying attention to that. Like in traditional Buddhism, it's almost kind of like renunciation is one of the factors of the Eightfold Path. Like Nekkhamma Sankappa is part of the Eightfold Path. But traditionally in Buddhists, we tend sometimes to kind of outsource the renunciation to the monastics. right? They'll renounce for us, and we'll sort of make some offerings and celebrate their renunciation. I'm not saying completely, but often that kind of tends to be the way. So maybe we need to start thinking that renunciation itself is not a bad thing, right? But doing with less. And how do we do with less? And you can see here on the streets in San Francisco, and so something I've read about before, but it's still really shocking to see, in the amount of homeless people there are on the streets. Why? Because some people have decided that we own this stuff and you can't have it. That's basically what it is. Which in the Aganya Sutta was the beginning of the decline of humanity. When people started dividing the land up and saying, this is mine, you can't have it. So, are we not the same as those people who are living on the street? And are we not the same as the people whose homes have been taken from them in Fiji? Are we not the same as the people who are suffering from the typhoons in the Philippines? Are we not the same as the people who are suffering these things all around the world? Because these sufferings will come for us. And we can insulate ourselves from it a bit, and we can hide from it a bit, and we can pretend and sort of play, and people take these things like they're just a joke. Recently in Sydney we had a very inspiring climate strike. I'm sure they have in San Francisco as well. There were like 50,000, 60,000 people on the street. And were you guys down there? Did you go for the climate strike?
No, but we participated.
You participated. You gave moral support? You participated.
I rang our monastery bell and we gave talks.
Okay, very good. Very good encouragement. You're a bit out of town anyway, so I'm in town, so I don't have an excuse. I can just jump on the train and go down there. And it's incredible. There's all of these kids down there, like even some of the families. I was in one family, a number of weeks ago. Lovely people, lovely Sri Lankan family. I've known them for many years, and they're like, the daughter wanted to go on this climate strike, and Mum was like, well, you have to do your homework first. And I'm like I'm in their home. I don't want to say anything that's going to upset them in their home, but I'm like, sense of proportion, please. So these kids know about it, and I've met kids who are like traumatized with anxiety because of climate change, devastated, suffering from depression, and you're like, yeah, it seems like a reasonable response. Like, I can't see somebody who's like that and say, you're wrong, do X, Y, Z, and you'll feel better. We have to start by listening to people. This actually is perfectly reasonable, and I think that we're coming into this time because the uncertainty is so great. We need to accept and to support a whole range of what people are doing about it. It's not that everybody's path will be the path of activism or the path of political change. Some people do that great, right? Some people may be offering mindfulness courses to help people deal with the anxiety or whatever you're doing, right? Some people may be just freaking out and paralyzed and not able to do anything. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable response, right? And these times of uncertainty are just there, and they're so great. So don't split up. You could just allow me to finish up here. Don't split up. But one thing which, for everybody here, perhaps more than you know, is rather than we should be looking for somebody else to give us a solution, looking for somebody else to give us some support, to appreciate the fact that we have the Dhamma and we have that support of those wisdom teachings that give us an understanding of impermanence and interdependence and compassion. And we have a responsibility to be the support for others, and to reach out to them and to listen to them and to share whatever wisdom that we can. this kind of wisdom of the Buddha's teachings has been passed down for so many years. One practical thing, I'll just finish off with one practical thing for just to bear in mind. We mentioned a bit earlier historically about the shift towards modernist Buddhism. Modernist Buddhism paints itself as being rational, and it's a rational and often urban movement. And kind of modernist Buddhism tends to kind of look down on village Buddhism. And something that I'd just like to suggest is that village Buddhism has always been there. And they kind of know something that maybe we don't know. And my origins in Buddhist practice was through a very poor village in Thailand. And you can see that the way that the Dhamma manifests and works through that is actually very profound. And so it's just a suggestion that maybe we have something to learn from those people who've been living and practicing Dhamma at the very foundational level in their land and in their place for such a long period of time. So, sorry, please, what were you going to say?
Playing out in our society right now,
In
between the urban areas and the rural
right,
areas.
yeah.
So, to learn something from the village society, like for instance, well, Shila Samadhi Panya, Shila,
Right.
just Shila.
Right.
Is Shila really being practiced at that level? At the level, do you see that happening at the level of the village Dhamma?
Yeah.
They're practicing Shila.
Sure. I mean, you can't have an idealistic perspective, right? It's not like everyone in Buddhist villages is doing some kind of idealized practice, but it's there, you know, and it informs a lot of the values that people have. Now, it informs those values imperfectly, and you know, certainly we don't idealize those things. But I've seen. I'll just give you one example. When I stayed a year in a hut in a teak forest in northern Thailand, in a province called Nan. Have you been to Nan?
Yes.
Yeah. You've been, you know Nan? Well, you should visit there one day. Now, Nan's a beautiful province on the Lao border, and I lived in between two villages. And so every day I would go for alms round, take my bowl, and walk to the village for alms, to one or other of those villages. And in one of those villages, I would go for alms round and I would get a few lumps of sticky rice and maybe a banana if I was lucky. And the other village I would go to, and when I came home, my back would be sore. There'd be like lines on my hands from the weight of the plastic bags that I was carrying.
Oh, no.
And I could hardly make it back home. Why is that? Why was there such a difference between those two villages? Well, one of those villages had a good monastery in it, and one didn't. In one village, there was a bad monk who used to just lie around all day watching telly or something like that. And the whole feeling in the village was bad and down and lost and no good. And the other village had this fantastic monk there who was really working with all the villagers, doing the education programs, getting all the kids in, ordaining them. And the spirit in the village was totally different. And it manifested in that absolutely real and very delicious way. So, that to me is an example of what a difference it can make, that if you really are bringing Dharma into that place.
Two different villages. Right?
Two different villages, yeah. Yeah.
So even there, it's not even. It's not.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Some villages are Dhammic and some villages are not.
And they change and they get better and worse, and yeah. So it's not like there's a magic. I'm not saying there's a magic fix or something like that, but I'm saying that there's something about it that we can learn from.
I was just thinking about, because I grew up in a little ancient village in England,
Oh, really?
and one of the things that was everybody did, you didn't even think about it, and England is pretty wet a lot of the time. Everybody hung their clothes on a line, and nobody had a washing machine. Well, pre-television, nobody had cars. There was no television. There was a few radios. It was pre-mechanized stuff, basically, and so. And to run a dryer is a lot of energy. And I met somebody on the trail in the Oakland Hills, this man, and I said, well, here's a thought. How about this? We just, because I hang our washing out, and I said, how about we don't use a dryer? You know, that's a lot of energy, because I had a solar house, so I know how much energy. And the man said, well, we don't want our underwear. We don't want other people to we don't want to share a machine with other people. I'm thinking, huh? But we don't want anybody to see our washing. And I said, I get it. In America, the only people that hang their washing on the line are poor people. Literally, it was amazing different. You know, you can get doctors hanging out stuff on the line in England. Here it's really materially poor people. And I thought, what a difference culturally. And I'm thinking, if we get, you know, if we're not locked in fear and creativity can't go together. Because there's always something we can do, however small. Like in India, they develop refrigerators and non-electrical refrigerators. They've just done that. They won awards for it. And that's a third of somebody's electricity. Or could we eat differently? There's always something we can do, you know. And I was thinking about what you said, listening to you, and I was thinking, when I was with a dying friend who was in great pain, and what came to me when you were talking was Thich Nhat Hanh saying, the greatest gift you can give to anybody is just to be there, really be there. And when you were saying that we can just listen to people and be there with climate change, just let it in basically, let the dying in, let the pain, it just be there with that person or that situation like climate change. And from that springs something else, this amazing other thing that happens, which it does.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's incredible that you're sitting here, and you know you're not that old,
71.
and you, like I said, and you've lived through that whole cycle.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Incredible, right? We forget how weird this is. Everything that we have, it's so.
Yeah, I grew up part of my childhood, no electricity, no running water.
Yeah.
You know, and just I like those villages.
And we go to monasteries where we have a hard time actually doing it to get it like that, and it's, when it happens, we love it, right? But you have to go so far away to make a place where that's going to be like that. It's incredible. And you see, like even things like being able to rediscover the nighttime.
Wow.
Rediscover the nighttime.
Quiet.
Yeah.
Simple question. Since Thich Nhat Hanh made brought up, and I think maybe 50 years before you came to do the retreat with Ajahn Tong. So at the foothills of Chiang Mai, Doi Sute was actually a place, it's a stream and a lot of huts, and there was a meeting of 15 people that formed Ayya, which of course Thich Nhat Hanh, Saw Sivalak, and all of the Ayya people.
The Buddhists.
Yeah,
Ajahn Sulak, yes. Right. So basically, a lot of things seem to evolve out of Jim, right? Because it's a creative spirit, which we would not go there. Have friends about here understand. Basically, with the work that INEP has been trying to apply, how do you see sticking together? Is it no splitting up? In terms of leadership that can come. I'm not the burning feminist, but I think I'm a flaming one, maybe.
Flaming feminist? Flaming feminist.
The interaction, or what do you call synergy, between the emerging what do you call it, dual sangha could contribute to the energy that INEP may need, forgive me, which it has been, of course, under a tremendous intention. But as time evolved, you said things changed.
Right.
How could we see this energy of new movement now from our generations? There's no splitting up between generations either. Could reignite INEP spirit from 50 years ago?
I honestly don't know, because I couldn't say enough about that. But that idea that I was saying about the not to split up, I mean, that applies on every level. But I was particularly thinking about just a very kind of local and immediate level, that of dealing with the people around you, rediscovering things like neighbourhoods and who are those people that we encounter, and the people in the Buddhist communities, because this is like so precious, and we in a sense we have a space now where we can do this, and so let's appreciate it, and let's figure out ways that we can bring people together at, whatever level it might be.
Is the INEP Sangha.
Yeah.
How do we not forget the first kind of global international Buddhist effort? I'm sure many have been prior to INEP. I'm sure that
What
many
is INEP?
International Network of Engaged Buddhists, which focus or prioritize in the last 15, 20 years on global
You mentioned the two villages.
Yeah.
And the one village that had a lot of tasty food.
Right.
That one they were really giving trainings.
Right.
Really bringing the Dhamma into training programs,
Very actively, yeah.
and dedicatedly for the people.
Yeah.
And I feel like there may be an answer there. Because if we look at what people are getting depressed about, or what they're feeling despair about, or so much anxiety, or even just not being able to look at things and turning away and just being busy and distracted and hoping somebody else takes care of it, I think we have, if we know the Dhamma, there is in the Dhamma the means, the skillful means to meet each one of these things that the people are experiencing. It would not be difficult to develop trainings for the people. You said we should be doing something to help others in these regards. I think you're right. I think we have the Dhamma. Create the trainings to help the people to be able to process what their hindrances are.
Yeah.
And help them out of the despair and the anxiety and all of that, and then how they can bring the Dhamma to other people in these situations.
And I would love for that to be...
International Network of Engaged Buddhism, this is one of the things that they've done great in past times as workshops and trainings in past years, but not only International Network of Engaged Buddhists. So many of those who are here are Buddhist leaders and Buddhist teachers and involved in Buddhist groups, or know the Dhamma enough, as I know many of you know the Dhamma enough to know what there is in the Dhamma that can meet the hindrances that are arising to people, that are blocking them from responding effectively in wholesome and excellent ways.
And those things. What I would really like to be interested in doing is doing things on a more practical level. Like we're in the Katina season at the moment.
Yes.
And one of the things about the Katina season is that you have a situation where you have a bunch of monks or a bunch of nuns living in a monastery for a retreat, and then at the end of it you have the Katina ceremony. Now the Katina ceremony is not just a ceremony, but it's a work project. Right? You actually get together and sow a road. So you have to actually cooperate, working together to do something positive. And I think that even just sewing, I'd like to do like an end of the world knitting circle. So it's very practical skills, right? And talking and these kinds of things, rather than just necessarily just be, purely on a theoretical level, but actually learning practical skills as well. Look, sorry, Numpet, sorry to interrupt, but we are over time now, and I'm conscious that some people may want to leave, and also I have to get to my place before they lock it. I don't mind having solidarity with the homeless people of San Francisco for one night. Of Berkeley, we're not in San Francisco. I don't understand these things, okay? But I'm sure that my hosts, Venerable Hong Shua, would be probably quite embarrassed if I were there. So might be good if we could wrap up about now. Is that okay? Sorry to cut you off there. Okay, very good. So may I just express once again, thank you so much to Wanmo especially for hosting us here, and the Dhamma College of Berkeley, and to Ayya and the community of Dhammadharani for inviting me and encouraging me to come, and also a special acknowledgement to Nampet, who helped invite me from Sakidita, and also Susan, who is Susan Pembroke from the Ventura Insight Group, who also invited me to come as well. So I'll be around in San Francisco in the Bay Area for another few days. So please be great to see you at any of those events.
Bhante, we'd like to, from Dhammadharani, we'd like to offer something to Wanmo. Thank you so much for hosting us. And
just to show appreciation of your generosity and support to the community, Buddhist community in the Bay Area.
Thank you so
and of
much.
course elsewhere as well, all over the world.
So
with that notion, I would like to present you.
Let me tell Bhante Sujato what this is.
With the picture that reminds us of your role in enabling the chanting, Patimokkha chanting of the bhikkhus in one room and bhikkhunis in the other building next door. It was historical that both Ovat Patimokkha from two communities, male and female, Buddhist community, will taken place on behalf of your generosity and support. So I'd like to offer you this picture to remind you of that day.
Like to share with everyone.
Can I see it too?
Beautiful. The Bhikkhuni Patimokkha, which Mangalam centers, which is just the neighbor here, where we had the recitation at the temple. Both recitations were happening at the same time. Samadhi Patimokkha, harmony Patimokkha together, and that was just a short time ago here during our international Tipitaka
So that was very special.
here at Dharma College.
It was very auspicious. It happened very naturally, Bhante. There was no, just the timing. We fell on the
It was the first time
day.
that we did that.
It
For the
didn't.
monks also the first time.
Who was reciting with the Bhikkhuni?
Together for that. One of the Buddha Chatipatis Bhikkhunis from Alaska.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They all
The
memorized
Alaskan Bhikkhuni.
both Patimokkha recitations.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And the bhikkhus were reciting here in this room. And
The nuns were at
female
And for those of you who are not familiar,
building next door.
Patimokkha is the recitation, fortnightly recitation, when there are sufficient quantity of either bhikkhus or bhikkhunis to recite our code of conduct. But especially it relates to that theme of this talk, because the whole point of Patimokkha is for harmony, and it's about bringing the community together. Samaheva, Samagehi, Samudamanehi, all as one, reciting in harmony and rejoicing. And that's an act which is done together in order to build that harmony. It's not something that just happens.
Building. So with appreciation of her being instrumental for that occasion.
All the blessings and just everything that's unfolding naturally, without any contriving, and just perfectly manifesting. And we're the beneficiaries to see that harmony, and the sense was just so full of just seeing the monks on one side, bhikkhus on one side, the nuns on the other side, and lay people behind. It was really a memorable experience. It felt like community.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
I guess this is the end of the evening, and Venerable Sujato, thank you so much for being here and sharing with all of us. And to continue to, I hope, return back to the Bay Area when it's the right time, and for us to get connected to Sutta Central. And we talked earlier about doing something together, which I think will have benefit, great benefit to the people in India, and maybe even